The air smelled of pine resin and freshly cut grass. It was one of those perfect late summer afternoons, the kind that makes you forget about deadlines and taxes. I was sanding the hull of an old sailboat, a 30-year-old vessel I'd found rotting in a barn. The work was slow, methodical. Sawdust clung to my forearms, and the rhythmic scrape of the sander was the only sound breaking the quiet of my backyard. To me, it wasn't noise. It was the sound of something broken being made whole again. If you're a regular on Karenology, you probably know that kind of peace never lasts. I heard the crunch of gravel on my driveway first, sharp, deliberate steps. I didn't even have to look up. It was Mr. Clark, the president of our Homeowners Association. He walked like he had a steel rod for a spine and dressed like he was perpetually on his way to a funeral for someone he didn't like. He stopped at the edge of my lawn, his shadow falling long over the boat. He was holding a crisp white envelope. He didn't say hello. He just held it out. "This is for you," he said, his voice flat. The old faded anchor tattoo on the back of his hand seemed to tighten as he gripped the paper. I wiped my hands on my jeans and took it. It felt oddly heavy. "What is it, Clark?" "A violation notice," he said, with just a hint of satisfaction, "and a fine." I tore it open. My eyes scanned the jargon, the neatly printed lines that felt like tiny daggers. The amount jumped out at me first, $750. Then the reason, excessive noise from repair work and unauthorized long-term storage of a watercraft. I looked from the paper to my hand sander, then to the boat sitting peacefully in its cradle. It was absurd. Have you ever been hit with a complaint so ridiculous you didn't even know where to start? My first instinct was to laugh. My second was to tell him exactly where he could store his violation notice. But I'm 52 years old. I've learned that sometimes the quiet path is the smarter one. At least, that's what I told myself. My hand slipped into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold, familiar steel of my dad's old multi-tool. It's a habit. He gave it to me when I was a kid. Said it could fix almost anything. In that moment, it was just a piece of metal to ground me. "The noise is a hand sander, Clark," I said, keeping my voice level. "And the boat is on my property behind a fence. I've read the bylaws." He gave a thin, dismissive smile. "The board interprets the bylaws. The noise is disruptive. The boat is an eyesore. Pay the fine." He turned without another word and walked away, his back ramrod straight. That night, I sat in front of my computer, the stupid piece of paper next to my keyboard, $750. It was infuriating, but fighting it would mean meetings, arguments, and a whole lot more of Clark's smug face. I'm a former risk auditor. I spent 30 years of my life calculating the cost of conflict for a big insurance firm. My gut told me the cheapest option was to just swallow my pride and pay up. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping bureaucrat, you know that feeling. If you do me a favor and hit that like button, so I know I'm not the only one. So I logged into the Homeowners Association portal. The website was as gray and lifeless as Clark's personality. I found the violation, clicked the Pay Fine button, and entered my card details. Done. Problem solved. Let him have his petty victory. I could live with it. But then I saw it. Below the payment confirmation, there was another line. A notification I hadn't seen before, posted just an hour ago. It read, "Formal complaint filed." My blood went cold. A formal complaint to whom? I clicked on it. A short, sterile message popped up. A formal complaint regarding unapproved commercial activities and elevated property risk has been filed with your homeowner's insurance provider. What? I scrambled to open my email. And there it was. An email from my insurance company sent 20 minutes earlier. The subject line was "Urgent Policy Review for your property." I opened it, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. The corporate language was polite, but the message was a punch to the gut. It mentioned an official report from my Homeowners Association about a repair workshop operating on my property. It talked about flammable materials and unpermitted structural alterations. It was all lies, of course, but these were the trigger words. These were the words I used to write in my own reports to justify doubling someone's premium. The email ended with a sentence that made the floor drop out from under me. Your policy is now under review for non-compliance, which may result in a significant premium increase or non-renewal at the end of the term. And just like that, the $750 fine felt like a sick joke. It was never about the boat. Clark hadn't just fired a warning shot. He'd launched a torpedo, and it was aimed right at my home. The screen glowed in the dark room, each word from the insurance company a tiny digital ghost come to haunt me. Non-renewal, significant premium increase. These weren't just threats, they were financial execution orders. My house, the one place I thought was mine, was suddenly standing on a trap door, and Clark's hand was on the lever. For a few long minutes, I just sat there, the low hum of the computer the only sound. The anger I felt earlier had evaporated, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. It was the same feeling I used to see on the faces of people whose policies I had to cancel. Funny how the world turns. My first call the next morning was to my insurance agent. I got a call center. A disembodied voice, chirpy and utterly unhelpful, told me that a formal complaint from a governing body like a Homeowners Association triggers an automatic review. "There's nothing I can do until the review is complete, sir," she said. "The system has it locked." "It's based on lies," I said, my voice tight. "It's a personal vendetta. You can file a dispute after the review is complete, sir." The system. It was always the system. A perfect shield for people who don't want to deal with problems. I hung up, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an angry insect. Defeated, I decided to get out of the house. I needed coffee, and more importantly, a sense of normalcy. I drove down to the little community hub at the entrance to our neighborhood, a small building with mailboxes and a glass-encased bulletin board. As I pulled up, I saw Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down retrieving her mail. She saw me, gave a tight, awkward smile, and then hurried to her car, her eyes fixed on the ground. Strange. Then I saw it, pinned right in the center of the corkboard, a place usually reserved for notices about bake sales and lost cats. It was a photograph, a slightly blurry, blown-up picture of my backyard, my boat, the sawhorses, the tarp with my tools. It looked like a crime scene. Tape below, it was a piece of white paper with thick black marker scrawled across it. "Some people forget we live in a community, not a junkyard. Respect the rules or move out." It was anonymous, of course, but I knew who wrote it. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, even the ones who weren't there, the whispers in the community chat, the averted gazes. This wasn't just a fine or an insurance problem anymore. This was public shaming. Clark was turning me into the neighborhood villain. I stood there for a long moment, my hands clenched into fists. The feeling of being isolated, of being judged by everyone, it's a heavy weight. Have you ever been on the receiving end of something like that, where you're guilty until proven innocent? My mind was racing. A vendetta this personal had to have deeper roots. It couldn't just be about a boat. I needed to understand what was really driving him. I needed information. There's only one place in a small town where history is kept, both the official and the unofficial kind, the local library. The library was quiet, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. It was a refuge. Evelyn, the head librarian, was a woman in her late 60s with eyes that saw everything. She'd been there for 40 years. She was our town's unofficial historian, the keeper of secrets. She watched me as I browsed the local history section, pulling out binders of old town council meeting minutes. "Looking for something specific or just running from the storm?" she asked, her voice soft. I gave her a weary smile. "A little of both, Evelyn, trying to understand our Homeowners Association's sudden interest in my hobbies." She nodded slowly, adjusting her glasses. She glanced around the empty library, then leaned slightly over the counter. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's not your hobbies, dear. It's you. It's that piece of land." Then she added the words that would change everything. "Clark has always been obsessed with rules, especially the ones about clear access and property lines." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "It got worse after that incident with the fire department a few years back." I looked at her, confused. "The fire department? What incident?" Evelyn gave a slight shrug, a gesture that said she'd already said more than she should. She straightened up, her librarian persona clicking back into place. "It's all in the public record if you know where to look." She tapped a finger on a thick, dusty binder on a lower shelf. "Town Emergency Services reports. Very dry reading." Her eyes told me it was anything but. An incident? A fire. A connection to Clark and his obsession with rules. The pieces were scattered, meaningless on their own, but for the first time, I felt like I was holding something other than a fistful of nothing. a tiny, flickering flame of a lead. I pulled the heavy binder from the shelf, the plastic cover crackling in the silence of the library. The binder felt like a slab of granite in my hands. The pages were yellowed, filled with dry, official language and technical reports. I took it to a small table in the back, the light from the high window casting a dusty yellow beam across the table. For over an hour, I sifted through reports of downed power lines, fender benders, and a memorable incident involving a raccoon in the high school cafeteria. I was starting to think Evelyn had sent me on a wild goose chase. Then I found it. It was a report from 5 years ago, a small kitchen fire in a house on the far side of the neighborhood. The official summary was brief, minor damage, no injuries. But attached to it was a supplemental report from the fire captain. That's where the story was. The captain wrote that their main engine was delayed by almost 7 minutes. The street was choked with cars parked on both sides for a party, a big one. The truck was too wide to get through. They had to send a smaller unit through a back route, losing precious time. The report ended with a stern recommendation to the town council and the Homeowners Association to enforce clear access routes for emergency vehicles. And then, at the very bottom, in the field for the property where the party was held, Clark's address. It all clicked into place. The shame, the obsession with rules, the vendetta against anything that could be twisted into a violation. He wasn't just a power-tripping bully. He was a man haunted by a mistake that could have cost lives. And, instead of owning it, he'd turned that fear outward, weaponizing it against his neighbors. Me and my boat, we were just his newest scapegoats. Tucked into the back sleeve of the report was a folded map of the neighborhood, a fire safety plan. It showed the primary streets in green and the designated emergency access routes in red. I traced the lines with my finger. The main roads were exactly as the captain described, narrow, easily blocked. And then I saw it. There was only one other way for a full-sized engine to reach the back half of the subdivision. A thin red line, a service road. An unpaved, little-used track that ran along the edge of the woods. A track that started right at the back of my property. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind you get when you finally see the shape of the puzzle. This whole thing, the fines, the insurance complaint, the public shaming, it was all a smokescreen. He wasn't trying to punish me for breaking a rule. He was trying to get control of my land. That service road was his vulnerability, and my property was the gatekeeper. I folded the map and put it in my pocket. Walking out of the library, the world felt different, sharper. The fight was no longer about a $750 fine. It was about something much bigger. The first thing I did when I got home was walk the back of my property line. The service road was overgrown, barely visible, but it was there. A rickety chain-link gate, my gate, was the only thing separating my yard from the dirt track. It was rusted but functional. It was my access, my leverage. I decided my first move had to be by the book. I spent the rest of the day drafting a formal, meticulously documented appeal to the Homeowners Association board. I didn't mention the fire report or the service road. Not yet. That was my ace in the hole. Instead, I focused on the facts. I attached the manufacturer's decibel specs for my hand sander, proving it was quieter than a normal conversation. I included photos of my boat, neatly covered and secured. I cited the specific bylaws he was misinterpreting. It was professional, logical, and undeniable. I sent it off feeling a small spark of hope. I was a risk auditor after all. I knew how to build a case. I'd show them that this wasn't just some guy yelling about his rights. This was a calculated, evidence-based argument. They'd have to listen. The next 2 days were silent. No response from the board. The post on the bulletin board stayed up. I started to get a few sympathetic but cautious nods from neighbors. They'd seen the post, heard the whispers. They were waiting to see who would win. And then, on Saturday morning, it happened. I was woken up by the sound of a heavy truck, its engine rumbling, its backup alarm beeping incessantly. I looked out my window, and my stomach twisted into a knot. A large flatbed truck was parked on the street in front of the service road entrance. 2 men in work vests were unloading stacks of cinder blocks, pallets of concrete bags, and wooden beams. I ran outside. What's going on here? One of the workers, a guy with a sun-beaten face, barely glanced at me. HOA project, he grunted, heaving another cinder block onto a pallet. Gotta store this stuff somewhere. They were dumping it all right in front of my back gate, completely blocking the entrance to the service road. I saw Clark standing across the street, watching, a smug little smile playing on his lips. He was making his move. He walked over, his hands in his pockets. "Preparing for the community auction next weekend," he said, his voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "Just some temporary storage. Hope it's not an inconvenience." Oh, it was an inconvenience. It was a declaration of war. He was physically walling me in, cutting off my only piece of leverage. I looked at the growing mountain of construction materials, then back at Clark's triumphant face. The quiet path was officially closed. The wall of construction materials was a monument to his arrogance. Cinder blocks, bags of cement, splintered wooden beams, all piled high, a fortress of spite blocking my gate. For a moment, I just stared at it, the sheer audacity of the move sucking the air from my lungs. It was so blatant, so openly hostile. Clark stood there, watching me, waiting for me to explode. And I almost did. I could feel the hot, angry words bubbling up in my throat. But then I remembered my dad's multi-tool in my pocket. He always said, "Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it." An explosion was what Clark wanted. It would just be more ammunition for his campaign to paint me as the unstable, aggressive neighbor. So I took a deep breath. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "The community auction," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "Right, of course." I turned and walked back into my house without another word. I could feel his confused stare on my back. He expected a fight, not quiet compliance. Let him wonder. Let him think he'd won this round. Because sitting in that dusty library, I hadn't just found a fire report. I'd found a new strategy. I fired off a furious email to the Homeowners Association board, protesting the illegal obstruction of an emergency access route. I was careful with my wording, making it sound like I was on the verge of losing control. I accused them of endangering the community and threatened legal action. I wanted them to see me as emotional, rash, and predictable. The response came a few hours later, just as I'd expected. It was a formal letter from the board, CCing every resident in the neighborhood chat. It dismissed my claims as hysterical and unfounded. It included a statement from Clark explaining that the materials were for a beloved community event and would be removed shortly after. My angry email was attached to the bottom, a perfect exhibit of my unhinged behavior. The social media fallout was immediate. The neighborhood chat lit up. "He's losing it." Such an overreaction. Why does he hate community events? I was being publicly crucified. Clark had played it perfectly. He had goaded me into a reaction and then used it to isolate me completely. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another 1-star review on my little furniture restoration business page. "Unstable and aggressive owner. Avoid." The weight of it all was crushing. My insurance was in jeopardy, my neighbors hated me, and now I was physically blocked in. The lawyer I consulted that afternoon was the final nail in the coffin, a tired, overworked guy who'd seen too many HOA battles. He looked over my paperwork, sighed, and told me I had a case, but it would take months, maybe years, and thousands of dollars I didn't have. "Honestly, man," he said, rubbing his eyes, "it's usually easier to just sell and move." That night, I hit my lowest point. I sat in my workshop, the half-finished boat looking more like a carcass than a project. The smell of sawdust and varnish, which usually brought me comfort, now just smelled like failure. I was beaten. Clark had won. The thought of packing up, of letting this man drive me from my home, was a bitter pill. You ever feel so cornered that giving up feels like the only sane option? I was there. But as I sat there, staring at the wall, a different thought began to form. A quiet, persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I was an auditor. I spent my life looking for hidden risks, for the things people don't want you to see. I had been fighting Clark on his terms, the rules, the complaints, the public opinion. It was time to change the battlefield. It was time to do my old job. I pulled out my laptop and started digging, not into HOA bylaws, but into the auction itself. It was billed as a charity event, raising money for a new playground. Noble enough, but who was running it? Who were the vendors? What were the logistics? I spent hours cross-referencing names from the HOA newsletter with public business records. And then I found him. David, a member of the HOA board. A guy who always stood silently behind Clark in meetings. On paper, he was a retired sales manager, but a little more digging revealed something else. Before sales, for over 20 years, he was a firefighter. A new surge of energy shot through me. This was it. A man who would understand the fire captain's report not as a historical document, but as a current, terrifying liability. The next morning, I saw my chance. David was out walking his dog. I grabbed the old fire map and my drone, a small consumer model I used for inspecting roofs, and went to meet him. I didn't approach him with accusations. I approached him as a concerned neighbor. "David," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "I've got a question for you. Something's been bothering me." He was wary, his hand tightening on the leash. "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of this thing with you and Clark." "This isn't about Clark," I lied. "It's about this." I unfolded the fire map. "This service road. It's the only way a full-sized engine gets to your house and mine if the main street is blocked. You know that better than anyone." His eyes flickered down to the map. The change in his expression was subtle, but I saw it. The casual neighborly mask dropped, and for a second, I saw the firefighter. The man who understood what 7 minutes could mean. "Clark says the materials are temporary," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Let me show you temporary," I said. I launched the drone. The small machine buzzed into the air, climbing high above the trees. On my phone screen, the neighborhood spread out below us, and the problem became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't just the block service road. Cars were already lining the streets in preparation for the auction. The entire subdivision was a tangled maze of choke points. I angled the drone's camera down, showing him the bird's-eye view. Then, I used a simple app to overlay a red line on the video, the path the fire engine would have to take. It was a dead end, a trap. David stared at the screen, his face pale. He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken understanding. He knew I was right. I watched him, my heart pounding. This was the pivot, the moment the game could change. Finally, he looked up from the phone, his eyes hard. "He's ignoring the internal safety protocols," he said, his voice a low growl. "We wrote them after the last time. He's ignoring them." He looked me straight in the eye. "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air. He wasn't just asking, he was offering a choice, a partnership. The wall Clark had built to trap me was about to become the stage for his own downfall. "What am I going to do?" I repeated, looking from the pale face of the former firefighter to the drone's live feed on my phone. The image was damning, a neighborhood turned into a death trap, all for a playground auction. I'm going to give him the stage he's always wanted. David looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done playing defense," I said. "Clark wants a public spectacle. He's going to get one, but it's not going to be my humiliation. It's going to be his." The rest of the day was a blur of quiet, focused activity. David, my new and unlikely ally, sent me a discreet file. The Homeowners Association's internal emergency protocols he'd mentioned, the ones Clark was ignoring. They were even more detailed than the fire captain's report, with specific rules about clear zones and access during community events. It was the smoking gun. Meanwhile, I spent hours editing the drone footage. I wasn't a filmmaker, but I knew how to tell a story with data. I took the raw video and turned it into a clear, terrifying narrative. I started with a wide shot of our peaceful neighborhood. Then, I overlaid the street map, highlighting the narrow roads. I animated a little red fire truck, showing it getting stuck, just as it had 5 years ago. I inserted quotes from the fire captain's report, the text appearing on screen in bold red letters. 7-minute delay. Access impeded. Then came the punch. I cut to the current drone footage, the block service road, the cars choking every street. I ran the fire truck animation again. This time, it couldn't even get close. The final shot was a slow zoom in on the pile of construction materials barricading my gate, the symbol of Clark's reckless authority. I kept it short, under 2 minutes. No music, no dramatic voiceover, just the cold, hard facts. I also did something else. I went to the town hall and got a copy of the permit for the auction. Tucked away in the fine print was a line stating that the event organizer is responsible for ensuring public safety and clear access for emergency services at all times. The permit was signed by one person, Clark. The day of the auction arrived. It was a perfect sunny Saturday. The whole neighborhood was out. People milled around the community lawn, sipping lemonade and bidding on donated items. The atmosphere was festive, cheerful. Clark was in his element, walking around like a king, shaking hands, his face beaming with self-importance. He saw me standing by myself near the back and gave me a condescending smirk, as if to say, "See, the community loves me. You're the outcast." He had no idea what was coming. The centerpiece of the event was a large projection screen set up behind the main stage, meant to display the big-ticket auction items. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a cheap tuxedo, was warming up the crowd. "And now for our grand prize," he bellowed. "A weekend getaway for two at a luxury resort." That was my cue. A friend of mine, a tech guy who owes me a favor, had helped me with the final piece of the puzzle. As the auctioneer gestured dramatically to the screen, the image of the luxury resort flickered and died. For a second, the screen was black. Then, a new image appeared. It was the opening shot of my video, the bird's-eye view of our neighborhood. A confused murmur went through the crowd. People looked around, wondering if this was part of the show. Clark, standing by the stage, froze. His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief, then dawning horror. The video played, the animated fire truck, the damning quotes from the report, the live footage of the block streets, the slow, final zoom on the barricade. Silence fell over the crowd, the cheerful chatter died. People weren't looking at the screen anymore. They were looking at Clark. When the video ended, the screen went black again. The silence was absolute, heavy, and accusatory. You could have heard a pin drop on the grass. I stepped forward. I wasn't holding a microphone. I didn't need one. My voice, clear and steady, cut through the quiet. "The last time a fire truck was delayed on these streets, it was because of a party at Mr. Clark's house," I said. "He was warned. The association was warned. They wrote new rules. Today, to raise money for a playground for our children, he broke every single one of them." I held up the auction permit. This permit makes him personally responsible for every life in this neighborhood right now. I turned to Clark. His face was ashen. He looked trapped, a cornered animal. "So, my question is," I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its edge, "how much is a weekend getaway worth when our homes could be burning down?" The crowd erupted. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was an angry mob. The spell was broken. Clark wasn't the strong leader. He was the man who had gambled with their safety. The public humiliation he had engineered for me had come back on him, 100 times worse. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice was drowned out by angry shouts. I saw David, the former firefighter, step up to the stage. He took the microphone from the stunned auctioneer. "He's right," David's voice boomed across the lawn. "As a former first responder, I can tell you this is a textbook catastrophe waiting to happen. We have been put at risk." It was over. Clark's reign was done, imploding in a public spectacle of his own making. I watched him being surrounded by angry neighbors, his face a mixture of terror and disbelief. I had won. But as I stood there, watching the chaos unfold, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. There was just a quiet, cold emptiness. I looked at the faces in the crowd, the same people who had shunned me just days before, now baying for Clark's blood. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the ugliness of it all. The auction disintegrated into chaos. The festive atmosphere curdled into a mix of fear and fury. People were yelling, pointing fingers, pulling their kids closer. Clark, who had been the master of ceremonies just minutes before, was now the villain, swallowed by a sea of angry faces. I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. I had done what I needed to do. I turned my back on the mob and walked home, the sound of their shouting fading behind me. My house was quiet. The silence was a stark contrast to the pandemonium I'd left behind. I walked into my workshop and stood before the half-finished boat. The project I'd started for peace had dragged me into a war. I ran my hand over the smooth, sanded wood. It was supposed to be a simple pleasure, a connection to something real in a world of digital noise and bureaucratic nonsense. Instead, it became the battlefield. Later that evening, David came by. He looked tired but resolute. "The board held an emergency meeting," he said, leaning against the doorframe of my workshop. "Clark resigned, effective immediately." I nodded. It was the only possible outcome. "And the rest of them?" "They're running for cover. An independent audit is being launched into the association's finances and procedures. The whole house of cards is coming down." He paused, looking at me. "They offered to make you the new president." The irony was thick enough to taste. The outcast they tried to expel was now being offered the crown. "No," I said, without a second of hesitation. "I don't want the power. I just want the system to be fair." David smiled faintly. "I figured you'd say that." This was the moment, the ethical fork in the road. I could have taken the power. I could have become the new Clark. Or I could fix the broken machine so that another Clark could never exist. It was an easy choice. "They also voted to drop all fines against you naturally," David continued, "and they're talking about compensation. For the damages to your reputation, the insurance hassle, they're trying to buy your silence." Compensation, the word hung in the air. Money, a balm for the wounds. It was tempting. I thought about the lawyer's fees, the hit to my business, the sheer stress of the last few weeks. But taking their money felt dirty. It would make me part of their game, the game of using money to smooth over problems instead of actually solving them. You know, sometimes the easy path is the most expensive one in the long run. What would you have done? Would you take the money? Let me know in the comments if you've ever faced a choice like that. "I don't want their money," I told David, "but I do want something." I spent the next hour laying out my terms. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a prescription. First, the Homeowners Association had to purchase a new, comprehensive liability policy from an independent insurer, one that specifically covered mismanagement and negligence by the board. As a former risk auditor, I would review the policy myself. This would make them accountable not just to the residents, but to a powerful financial entity. Second, the emergency access plan, including the service road, was to be formally integrated into the HOA's governing documents. The road would be cleared, graded, and marked as a permanent, unobstructed fire lane. No more temporary blockades. Third, a new independent safety committee would be formed. It would be made up of residents, and it would have the authority to override the board on any matter concerning public safety. I told David he should chair it. It was a complete overhaul. I wasn't just patching a hole, I was rebuilding the foundation. I was using my specific skills, the very ones that made me a target, to create a system of checks and balances. I was turning my 30 years of experience in the cold corporate world of risk into a shield for my community. David listened to it all, nodding slowly. When I was finished, he looked at me with a newfound respect. "That's brilliant," he said. "You're not just punishing Clark, you're making sure it can't happen again." He left promising to deliver my terms to the board. I knew they would accept. They were terrified of lawsuits, of further public exposure. They would agree to anything to make the problem go away. I walked to the back of my yard. The pile of construction materials was still there, a monument to a battle already won. I looked at the rusted chain-link gate. It was ugly, weak, a symbol of vulnerability. I grabbed my tools. The old, heavy bolt cutters felt solid in my hands. With a satisfying crunch of metal, I cut the old chain and lock. I swung the gate open. The path to the service road was clear. It felt symbolic. I had opened up the way, not just for a fire truck, but for a new kind of accountability in our neighborhood. As darkness fell, I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool night air. The shouts from the auction were long gone. The neighborhood was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of apathy anymore. It was the silence of a community holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. And I realized the multi-tool my dad gave me was more than just a tool for fixing things. It was a reminder that sometimes, to fix what's broken, you first have to be willing to take it all apart. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The changes I'd demanded were implemented with a speed I'd only ever seen when a corporation is trying to avoid a lawsuit. The pile of construction materials vanished overnight. A professional crew came in, cleared the service road, and laid down fresh gravel. A new bright red sign was installed. Emergency vehicle access. Do not block. It was a small thing, a piece of metal and paint, but it felt like a victory flag. The Homeowners Association board, now humbled and terrified, ratified every one of my proposals. David was appointed head of the new safety committee. A new insurance policy, vetted by me, was put in place. The power structure hadn't just shifted, it had been fundamentally rebuilt. There were checks and balances now. Clark's little kingdom was officially a democracy. I saw him only once more. He was loading boxes into a moving truck in front of his house. The "for sale" sign on his lawn was a stark final testament to his defeat. He looked smaller, grayer. When he saw me watching from my porch, he didn't scowl or glare. He just looked away, a man utterly broken by the very public opinion he had tried to weaponize. I didn't feel triumph, or even pity. I felt nothing. He was just a ghost, a memory of a fight that was already over. Life settled into a new normal. The awkward glances from neighbors were replaced by nods of respect, and even a few friendly waves. I was no longer the neighborhood pariah. I was the man who had fixed the unfixable. But the victory came with a price. The easy camaraderie I'd once had with some of my neighbors was gone. I was no longer just the guy down the street. I was a symbol, a reminder of a time they'd rather forget. I had saved the village, but in doing so, I had set myself apart from it. One evening, I sat in my workshop, putting the final coat of varnish on the sailboat. The rich amber liquid flowed from the brush, sealing the wood, making it gleam under the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The project was almost done. At the first meeting of the new reformed Homeowners Association, I was invited to speak. I kept it short. I didn't talk about the fight, or about Clark, or about victory. I talked about what it means to be a community. I told them that rules are meant to protect us, not to be used as weapons against each other, that a neighborhood is only as strong as the trust between its residents. As I finished, I walked to the head of the table where the new president sat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my dad's old multi-tool. It was worn, the steel smooth from years of use. It had been my anchor through this whole ordeal, a tangible link to my father's quiet strength. I placed it on the table. "My dad gave this to me," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "He told me it could fix almost anything, but some things can't be fixed by one person. They have to be maintained by everyone." I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors. "This is for the safety committee, a reminder to fix what's broken, properly this time." I walked out without looking back. A few days later, I finally finished the boat. I christened her the Auditor. On a crisp, clear morning, I hitched her to my truck and drove down to the lake. As I backed her into the water, she slipped off the trailer and floated, perfectly balanced. She was beautiful. I didn't take her out for a spin. Instead, I just sat on the dock, watching her rock gently on the water. The work was done. The fight was over. I hadn't just restored a boat. I'd restored my own sense of purpose. I'd lost a job once for being too principled, for refusing to bend the rules. I'd come here seeking peace, a quiet place to retreat. But you can't retreat from who you are. The skills I thought I'd left behind were the very ones I needed to protect my peace. I may have lost the easy anonymity of being just another neighbor, but I had gained something more valuable. I had learned that you don't find peace by running from conflict. You find it by facing it on your own terms and building something stronger in its place. And as I sat there, watching my boat drift under the wide open sky, I felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't the loud joy of a party. It was the deep, quiet peace of a job well done. And sometimes, that's the only victory that matters.